It's great to be joined today by Professor Michael Sandel, professor of political philosophy at Harvard University, and also author of the now in paperback book, The Tyranny of Merit: Can We Find the Common Good? It's so great to have you on. I appreciate your time.
Good to be with you, David.
So, to maybe start talking a little bit about the topic of merit, there's often sort of like two layers to this discussion. And one is a focus on an argument as to whether we or a particular country or society or economy have a real meritocracy. That's one piece of the conversation. The second part, which is less discussed, but arguably just as important, if we really did have a pure meritocracy, would that actually be a good thing? What would be the concerns? What would be the problems if it was really that everybody got what they, quote, deserved from whatever sort of perspective we want to approach that question? So can we maybe start with how we can combine these two questions and enter the kind of philosophy that you lay out in the book?
Yes, and I do address both questions, and you're right to distinguish them. It's very important. The first problem with meritocracy is that we don't live up to the meritocratic principles we profess. In Ivy League universities, for example, there are more students from the top 1% than there are from students in families in the bottom half of the income scale combined. If you come from an affluent family, the top quarter, you're 70% of the students who attend the 100 plus most selective colleges and universities, 70% come from the top quartile, well-off families. And do you know how many come from the bottom quartile, from low-income families?
It must be incredibly small.
It's 3%.
Right.
And now, so we don't live up to the meritocratic principles we profess. It isn't true, as the slogan we hear from politicians tells us, that you can make it if you try, that everyone really has an equal chance to succeed. So that's one problem with meritocracy. We haven't realized it. Chances are not truly equal. But there's a deeper problem, which is that the ideal is flawed. And this is really the heart of my argument in The Tyranny of Merit. Meritocracy has a dark side. And the dark side is that it is corrosive of the common good. And let me see if I can explain why, because this is a counterintuitive idea. We normally think that if only we could perfect the meritocracy, then we would have a just society.
Right.
But think about it. If it were really true that everyone's place in society and in the income scale were the result of their own doing, such that they could say, I've earned it, I deserve my place, then those who landed on top would believe their success was their own doing, the measure of their merit. And they would look upon those who struggle as deserving their fate as well. In fact, the person who coined the term meritocracy, he was a British sociologist, Michael Young, in 1958. He coined it, The Rise of the Meritocracy was his book, as a dystopian scenario, because he glimpsed this. He glimpsed the hubris that a meritocracy generates among the successful and the humiliation and resentment it generates among those left behind. Now, you asked me, David, how do I bring these two arguments together in the book? We've got, in a way, the worst of both worlds. We don't have a true meritocracy because opportunities are not truly equal. And yet, those who've landed on top, especially in recent decades, have come to believe that their success is their own doing and that they therefore deserve the full measure of the benefits that a market society showers upon them. So we have the hubris among the successful. We have the humiliation and the brewing resentment, understandable resentment, among those who struggle, even without a genuine meritocracy. And I think that the anger and resentment among many working people that elites, meritocratic elites, credentialed elites, look down on them. That set of resentments and anger, those grievances, gave rise to Trump, to Donald Trump, and they persist because the Democratic Party really has become the party of meritocratic credentialed elites and has lost contact with the working class, which once constituted its base, going back to the New Deal.
That's very interesting, and there's a lot of aspects there that we could dig more into. Because you mentioned political party, it seems that one of the, I don't even know that it's a side effect. I mean, it's really a direct consequence of the idea that everybody sort of has what they've earned and what they've deserved with equal opportunity. It seems like politically it's a recipe to justify doing very little to help those whose position is lesser or less good, because after all, it's a direct result merely of their actions that they are there. And in fact, this isn't theoretical. Some of the primary arguments made to cut welfare programs against the so-called enhanced unemployment during the pandemic that we've seen, against all of these things, is that it's some form of laziness or simply choosing one's circumstances. Why would we reward people for that? It has a very direct line to policy.
It does. And we hear this argument all the time in debates about welfare and other forms of income support. What's interesting is the way, troubling, but also important to come to terms with, the way the Democratic Party has migrated from being a party that speaks for the middle class and the working class against the privileged to being really the embodiment of well-credentialed elites and the professional classes. And this happened really over the last 4 decades as the Democratic Party, along with Republicans, embraced a kind of market-driven, finance-driven version of globalization. And education, admonishing people to improve themselves through higher education, that's been a big part of the message, especially of the Democratic Party. In the face of rising inequality and wage stagnation and job loss over the last 4 decades, what we've heard from politicians, mainstream politicians, is not an attempt to deal directly with inequalities of income and wealth and power. They've offered a kind of meritocratic workaround. They've offered individual upward mobility through higher education. If you want to compete and win in the global economy, go to college. What you earn will depend on what you learn. That was Bill Clinton. You can make it if you try. That was Barack Obama. But what they missed, now it seems inspiring to encourage everybody to go to college or university, and increasing access, broadening access to higher education, that's a good thing. I'd be the last person to argue against that. But as a response, or as the primary response to the rising inequality of the globalization decades, and as a response to the wage stagnation and job losses experienced by many working people, that is a pale offer, because those of us, it contains an implicit insult if you think about it.
Right.
Improve your condition, you will surmount wage stagnation and job loss and inequality. The problem is that you aren't well enough educated. The problem is not that we embraced policies that created this widening gap. It's that you are not well enough educated. So that was the insult implicit in the seemingly inspiring admonition to go get a better education. And the result was rising resentment among people who felt that their concerns were not being taken seriously.
Yeah, there's a couple of interesting things there. I mean, so we've seen a story that I first remember hearing it. I think it was with the senator from Pennsylvania, Rick Santorum, about maybe 20 years ago, where he started to say, we're education is liberal indoctrination. We're never going to have those people on our side because these mechanisms of colleges and universities, they're just going to indoctrinate people into left-wing sort of points of view. The left, on the other hand, has talked about let's get people college educations. Let's look at free college. Let's look at making it cheaper, more accessible, etc. And there's a couple of effects of that. One is that it's saying, if and until you do that, you will be less than the people that have done that. But also, isn't there some degree to which if everybody went ahead and did that, doesn't it sort of zero out and not even actually solve the problems of inequality that it claims to resolve?
You're right. It does not solve the problem of inequality. I think it's desirable for its own sake to make college free and or at least as accessible as possible
Yes.
to people from every background. That's a good in and of itself, and I'm all in favor of it. But the question is whether that is an adequate response to the inequality and wage stagnation of recent decades.
Right.
And I say it isn't. First of all, those of us who spend our days in the company of the credentialed can easily forget a simple fact. Most Americans do not have a four-year college degree. Nearly 2/3 do not.
Right.
So it's folly to create an economy that sets as a necessary condition of dignified work and a decent life a college degree that most people don't have. It also, this way of thinking, is too blinkered, too narrow an approach to inequality, because it leaves in place the steep hierarchy of prestige and esteem associated with people who are well credentialed.
Right.
And it implicitly disparages those who aren't. And this is embodied in policy and in funding. An economist at the Brookings Institution figured out that we spend about $164 billion a year helping people go to college. And how much do we spend supporting people who go in for vocational and technical training in community colleges at the federal level? About 1 billion, 162 to 1. Now, there's something wrong with that mode of funding for those forms of learning, including community colleges and technical and vocational training, that many people rely on to prepare themselves for the world of work. But this imbalance reflects this broader skewing of our values in the direction of valorizing people who are well credentialed and implicitly disparaging those who have not been to university. And this is showing up in the way people are voting. Trump managed to tap into the grievance against elites that many working people felt. And you can look at the voting behavior in the last few decades as the college-educated vote has gone increasingly for Democrats, and the vote among those who haven't been to college goes increasingly for Republicans, and especially Republicans like Trump of an authoritarian populist bent who channel the anger and the sense of grievance. And what's interesting is that a similar pattern is unfolding in Britain and in France and in other countries that have embraced globalization, emphasize the meritocratic solution to inequality, and have alienated center-left parties.
Now, there are some who would look at that phenomenon that you identify of the college-educated voter voting more for Democrats, voting more for center-left and left-wing parties in the UK, and say, well, there's a very simple, intuitive explanation for that. As you become more educated and you learn more about the world, you realize it's better for everybody. It's better for the country to vote for these people. You're doing an altruistic thing. You're doing a rational thing, and we're all better off for it.
Right. And that in itself, I think, is a hubristic analysis of the situation, because in fact, the policies, the kind of finance-driven globalization or neoliberal policies embraced by center-left parties, really center-left and center-right, but politically the toll has been taken upon the Democratic Party in
Yeah.
the US, the Labour Party in Britain, the Socialist Party in France. These policies have failed. And the 2008 financial crisis was the most dramatic illustration of how a kind of finance-driven globalization project fails. The recession that followed, which fell very heavily on low and middle income Americans, demonstrated further the failure. And then to add insult to injury is the meritocratic attempt to say that the solution to inequality and wage stagnation is not to reconsider the policies that we promoted and enacted for 30 or 40 years. It's simply for you to improve yourselves. There's something deeply disparaging about that. So I think that what I'm proposing for the Democratic Party is a shift to focus less on arming people for meritocratic competition and to focus more on the dignity of work, to ask what would it take to make life better for everyone, regardless of the university credentials they may have. And we could explore, and there will be debates about what counts, what policies actually support and affirm the dignity of work. But I think that should be the starting point.
Last thing I want to touch on, are there societies that we can look at either today or historically that have had maybe what we would call a more balanced or productive or rational view on the kind of interaction between merit and equality that might be interesting as a model in some sense?
Well, in some ways, and this is not to engage in golden age nostalgia, but political coalitions that formed during the time of FDR and the New Deal were an example of coalitions that did not depend on admonishing working people to improve themselves, but instead asked, how can we structurally reform the economy to strengthen collective bargaining, to strengthen unions, to give working people more of a voice, more of a say, as well as to be able to negotiate better working conditions. I think today, in some ways, Biden has begun to depart from the meritocratic, technocratic, neoliberal orientation of his predecessors. And it's interesting to notice that Joe Biden was the first Democratic nominee in 36 years without an Ivy League degree. This may have opened him at least a little to a broader horizon. He speaks more actually about the dignity of work than he does about meritocratic striving and meritocratic competition. There's also an interesting political figure now. If you looked at the German elections, the Social Democratic candidate, Olaf Scholz, has been trying to make this shift as well, to focus. He's actually offered a critique of the single-minded focus on merit and has emphasized instead notions of respect and the dignity of work. And I think that this is a more promising direction for the Democratic Party and for center-left parties generally.
I could not agree more. And much of what we've been talking about today is in the just out in paperback book, The Tyranny of Merit. Can we find the common good? We've been speaking with the book's author, Professor Michael Sandel from Harvard University. So appreciate your time and your insights today.
Thank you, David.